And I want to bring on our community partner and just awesome artist and community leader, Sara Cardona of Teatro Dallas. Um, she has been, really instrumental in um, helping us see art from a perspective that we don't see. Um, and really telling the community stories. Sada, welcome first of all, and thank you for being with us.
For having me, Jerry. That was really beautiful. And I think it's kind of an interesting segue into what I could add about healing through theater, because though theater is a little bit more structured, it has also ritual components. I stepped into this space where I took up the mantle of my elders because this
Right,
theater was founded by my parents, but expressly with a vision to make great art for our community, but also to empower voices that have long been silenced and to tell stories that are need to be told, and also in the telling of them release, the old fashioned idea of catharsis, that it's a release of pent up violence and energy and aggression, and all of that gets embodied in our communities. When we don't speak, we become sick. So
that's right.
so theater, is a great vehicle because different from, a private community in the sense of where everyone knows what to expect, that there's an element of theater of surprise. But what it is it also functions as a kind of public tribunal, in a way, because the stories then become made public to the larger audience of, the community, in this case of Dallas, where we
Mhm.
perform, who have both not heard the stories and in many instances are contributing to the oppression of those voices. So it is a closed loop. It's a circling back, and it makes
Right,
for accountability. But then in very pragmatic ways, sometimes it leads to actual change and discussion, and things happen because a story is put out into the world to exist as a work of art. So I think there's a correlation there. um Teatro Dallas, because our founder and my mother Cora is from Mexico City, and she was trained in the 60s, which, Latin America has, as a Latin American artist now, I would say there's a long tradition, sadly, both of oppression and dictatorship and colonialism. But the counterpoint to that is that there's also a long history of artists using unusual processes and methodologies for making art. That,
mhm,
I would say, what makes it distinct is that it goes beyond what we see often in the United States, which we have such a culture of capitalism, and our arts are often tied so deeply by, they're bound by that, that we have to make efforts to break those links to capitalism, because it dictates how art is made, who consumes it, etc. So in Latin America, for example, the tradition of what's called Teatro del Foro, which I guess the most famous instance is, the book by Augusto Boal, who was a Brazilian writer who wrote Theater of the Oppressed, right? But Teatro del Foro was the idea that you could use art to, almost like in an old-fashioned Socratic, open up a question, not necessarily to provide the answer,
right.
but by using multiple perspectives to really explore a topic. And foro is literally the forum. It's a circle. So the audience encircled often the actors, and the actors encircled the audience, because then there's no, that was the first breaking of capitalist methodology. So in capitalist theater, you have the audience who sits on one side, you know, the public, and then the stage where it's the actors, and of course been attempts to break that, what they call the fourth wall. There's a privileged viewpoint because the audience has paid, they're there, they're entertained, and things are from their perspective in a way. They just see things in this very passive way. But the minute you create a circle, you can no longer be passive. It's, you know, you are become part of the whole project, I guess. So, so this is one of the techniques that's used a lot in Latin American theater to borrow from the concept of both ritual and creating community, and also questioning and opening up discourse around truth and healing, is that you have to do it. The audience can't be passive, and so there's a lot of ways which Dallas has used many of those techniques in making their plays.
No, it's a great segue because I want to talk about Cement City. You know, all of us have been affected by the pandemic, but I don't think no other group has been affected more than artists, right? And particularly here in our theater, right, who is really performing to a captive audience who reacts and you know, to everything that's happening on the stage. And one thing I was excited to see, very excited to see, was Cement City, this theatrical performance that you all were going to show. But you all did just a wealth of research and work on this, and we're going to show the 9-minute film Faces of Cement City later on today. But can you tell us about just the method of collecting the stories about Cement City, this untold and almost erased story of you know, these Mexican workers and some Black workers and some white workers, but this large group of Mexican workers who built the city as we know it?
Sure. Well, so it's very interesting how we came to this story, because it already speaks again to getting out of the stage and going out into the community and listening, as it was mentioned quite a bit, is deep listening. And the way this began is, I mean, Teatro Dallas has had a pretty long history of taking theater to non-conventional spaces like taquerias and parks, and working in West Dallas in particular, and, you know, Oak Cliff and many neighborhoods in Dallas where we find our Latinx community. Additionally, because we have also had a long tradition of training actors who don't normally have opportunities because of language barriers, or maybe they have an accent, for example. You know, we've done bilingual shows. So our artists are also bilingual. And I think that's very important, because the minute you shift languages, you shift codes, and it opens up the ability to connect in ways that, you know, bypass. It's precisely because people have been discriminated against because of their language that they shut down. So what happened is that we were working already in West Dallas at Wesley Rankin Senior Center, Jerry theater with some of the older people there. We brought a woman from Venezuela who does theater to stimulate memory, especially with seniors. And oftentimes we find that song and storytelling, but also language, jogs memory. And because a lot of these folks have not been stimulated to speak and sing and do theater in Spanish, the minute that started happening, started getting stories from them. I mean, we're talking about the elders in the community. So we started getting some stories there, and we started to hear similar types of stories that went pretty far back. We were invited by one of those seniors to clean up a cemetery in West Dallas that we were not aware of. And when we went out there to clean up the cemetery just as a volunteer effort because we wanted to do it, we met Mr. Henry Martinez Sr., who founded the Ledbetter Neighborhood Association with his son. And he has been trying to tell a story for a very long time. And he has been diligent about it, but it wasn't reaching a larger audience. And some of it has been told over the last couple of years, but we just felt like it would make a great story, a theatrical story, because again, this needed to reach a larger audience. But in order to really, create good art, we had to just spend a lot of time embedded in our communities listening. So we entire summer, several weekends, going into people's homes and recording what they had to say. And Jerry, what's really fascinating is what people tell you when the camera's off and when the camera's on,
Yeah.
and when you speak Spanish and when you speak English. And so there was kind of almost double recording going on. And especially with our older generation who have felt, we have all felt discrimination, but the older generation, I'm talking about people who grew up in the 30s and 40s. I mean, that kind of segregation and violence leaves deep scars. And
Sure.
so people are afraid because they've lived a life of fear and of self erasure. And, it takes time to first break down the barrier of fear and then to encourage people um, to do something that they haven't done because they've spent a lifetime making them visible. And everything about this story is the trope was invisibility. And I still think that today. I see, when I drive around, it's very evident who constructs our streets, who does, who builds the bridges. But in some ways, very literally and very metaphorically, they're invisible, right? The people who mow our lawns, they're just sort of almost like in the background of human life here in the city. And
Yeah.
so this story about the segregated community of Mexican families who labored in the cement factories was so interesting because it was tied to the land. The reason that these factories were even there has so much to do with land that was stolen from native peoples that were already living here. And
Right.
then people were brought to work at these because they didn't migrate here in the traditional way. The companies literally went down to the border and put men on the trains and brought them here.
Right.
And then they were segregated, and then on top of that, we had this story not just of the community itself and the little schoolhouse that's out there, which we did an event at, and it's been restored. It's in Pinnacle Park in West Dallas, the Eagle Ford School. There was also the cemetery, and the cemetery located in the AT&T complex at Pinnacle Park. So in order to go into it, where we went to clean up, you have to get permission from AT&T. So this loops back again to this idea of capitalism and who controls things. In this case, literally, the cemetery is controlled by the corporation. And that in and of itself is a story of, we're looking at environmental racism, this kind of type of racism, which was unusual there.
You may have lost Sarah for a minute.